Hi, Raymond.
Hi, Brian. Today we're going to talk about loneliness in the time of pandemic. I know that I reached out to you several months ago and I very tentatively, very nervously sort of began to admit that I think I am lonely. And I remember that feeling like sort of like this sense that there was a weakness in that admission that I could be lonely. And I said, I'm not sure whether this is a short term loneliness or a long term loneliness. And you and I began to talk about what is this idea of loneliness and how do we know whether it's short term and long term. And I thought it's going to be a good idea it could be a good idea for us to unpack what that means. What is loneliness and why are we experiencing it even more during this pandemic?
Yeah, loneliness, I think, is if we could define it, it would be the lack of a connection, of an intimate relationship or a supportive relationship, someone that we can turn to who will hold us through we fall. And while many of us may have grown up holding ourselves during this time of pandemic in the isolation, we may feel like they've got no one to turn to.
So you're saying that this particular experience of the pandemic is bringing out this wound of uh, not feeling safe. Is that my understanding?
Yes,
And where is this not feeling safe, the wound of holding coming up from?
it's a very good question. The idea of being held first starts with our parents when we were born as an infant, and a parent holds us in their hands, and there's a certain safety and that comes with it. I see you, you have value. When we cry, a parent comes to attend to our needs. And for some
So you're
individuals,
saying that this is connected to the pandemic, that our of early years or our baby years and this moment is sort of colliding.
yes, there's the there are many factors to why they can affect it, right? Long-term isolation. But for those who feel a chronic sense of loneliness exacerbates it even more. And we all need a sense of belonging. For those who've been able to work in corporate America or in a workplace around the world, when they've been able to be surrounded by friends, there's a social sense of support, right? So even if
Yeah,
I'm not in an intimate relationship, I'm among friends and they help satiate my life with laughter and hope and a sense of
yeah. So the
belonging.
sense of being seen by other people
Mhm.
that's being taken away at this moment is, you're saying, connected to a childhood wound of not being seen. Is that
Of not feeling belong,
right?
right?
And does every child, does every baby go through that experience?
It's interesting that when they have a parent who is present and they feel like they're cared for, right? They don't feel neglected. Then those children or adults now feel they have the capacity to deal with this isolation, capacity to deal with this aloneness. They have the capacity to create. But for those who did not experience um, that separation, healthy separation, instead they feel separation anxiety, right? In that separateness, they've had to soothe themselves perhaps by playing, but they've had to hold themselves in their imagination. And so they had to be their own holding experience. It could not depend on the holding, safety, assurance, affirmation of a parent. And that
Yeah,
reinforcement that
you can see that the link between the pandemic and our childhood experiences is a big leap for us to make. So help us understand. So I come into this pandemic shutdown without the connection with my colleagues and friends and the people that generally give me the support of connection. And you're saying that this is sort of this isolation is this isolated feeling is more complex than I just want to have people around me that reflects, uh, you know, joy or that reflects fun. It's more complex than that, and that it has to do with so that if I admit I am also if I admit I'm lonely, do I have to admit? do I have to say to myself, oh, I have had neglectful parents? That seems to be like a really difficult connection to make.
Yeah. So our internal world, our primary world, how we behave in our primary world becomes how we behave in our second stage of life when we explore out into the real world. So for some that will be the exacerbation of it. I lived in a lonely world and now I lived in a lonely internal micro world of my childhood, and now the real world reminds me of that loneliness. The micro world where I had parents to protect me when I felt sick, take me to the hospital, nurse me, hold me, feed me. I don't have that now. Okay, so
So that as we're dealing with the lack of masks and lack of medical services and tests, it's re-injuring this wound that we may not have, or we don't have the secure parent looking after us. So one may argue that the
sorry.
prime ministers and presidents of the world at the moment are also stirring up that feeling, when we don't feel that there is a parent that's securely keeping us safe.
Yes, leaders, organizations, bosses, supervisors who do represent, they become the object of our parenthood, right? We turn to them for
Yeah.
safety. Yep, absolutely, Raymond.
Yeah. So that as the world is feeling unsafe, this childhood wound seems to occur and reoccur and be replayed out in our isolated lives, right? Because as children, I'm assuming we are so dependent on our parents for that experience of ourself and the world. When that's taken away, it causes some deep injury in our lives.
And that is from a perspective of the unconscious. And in the conscious mind, the reality that we are living in, to not have those social, that communal support, right? We all need that village. And when we don't have that, we can feel very, very much alone. How does one man, no man's an island, right? How can I myself provide all my needs? Am I capable of it? And there's a questioning of that.
Yeah, so that's a really interesting thing, right? What does the village do to help me understand who I am? So that if I'm not feeling safe and I don't have an access to the village, that almost feels like I am in survival mode.
Yeah, and that's where the concept, self-preservation essentially is to belong to a community.
Yeah, yeah. And so we are all feeling that our senses of communities our senses of parental security and safety is taken away, and then our senses of community identity is taken away. And so that's triggering a lot of loneliness, feelings of loneliness within us. So it's not just, we think, oh, we're not getting out there. So we think we're just not going to bars and we're not going to beaches, and we think this is the problem, but actually it's triggering all kinds of other things that we are not able to name effectively. And because we can't name effectively, we are actually reacting to this pandemic time in a very, very, sometimes very dangerous ways, right?
Yep, exactly.
To satiate the need, yeah.
Right, when we're afraid, when we're alone and we feel afraid, we're going to behave in very, very, very erratic ways.
Yeah. So what is the role of this aloneness? So if we can understand, okay, loneliness has arrived and it's stirred up all these emotional feelings that are connected to safety and our sense of safety and our sense of community in the world. Is there a way for us to look at this loneliness and say it has a function?
Yeah. So loneliness will often be seen as either in a state of anxiety or a state of depression. We may not have that name for it. We may not call it loneliness. In some cases, they might say you're just being lazy. You're not stimulated enough. Go play. And of course, we can all play. And we have our escape, whether it's social media, whether it's oversleeping, whether it's, eating, whatever it may be to satiate our anxieties, right? But there's basically, we can help people understand, right? Whether it's in psychotherapy, but really from this conversation, um, how does one transform or convert rather the feelings of I'm afraid, I am not able to hold myself, I don't belong, to a sense of that I do belong. How can I turn this time of quietness and solitude as a way to reassess myself, to release, to create, right? To look
So
at myself.
one level to be able to name the feeling of not being connected and being belonged, and then seeking those opportunities, right? So you can develop a sense of belonging from an online community as well, but it's not just FaceTime, right? It's not just this really the depth of connection that we have. So there's a lot of fatigue with these online Zoom calls, and there's a lot of fatigue happening because it doesn't satiate the depth of a connection that we're also looking for. So that it's not just that we create that bond, but that we create the depth of that bond.
Yes, and I think that's why the capacity to connect, right? I mean, I remember having to call my mom and just so thankful for technology, for telecommunication, right? Because it helps with that bond. So
Yeah.
I think there has to be a certain mindfulness in the strategic use of telecommunication. Are we going to perpetuate the sense of isolation? Or are we going to perpetuate like how wonderful it is to be able to connect with you?
So is it do we call one another and say we are depressed, or do we call one another and say this opportunity has given me an opportunity to reach out to the world and connect with you? So that's the difference, right? It's one, you can use technology to perpetuate the story that you are alone in the world, and the other one is you can use technology to reinforce the ability to connect again
I think it's
in
important
new
to
ways.
this, right? I'm calling you to tell you that I'm feeling really lonely right now. And then for the listener to help support that sense of loneliness as an active listener, not so much
Yeah,
to
so
minimize it.
it's a really good point, Brian. The active listener, right? So I think what you are saying is you're giving us all permission to feel this loneliness, because this loneliness has very complex origins of safety and community, and then to be able to express that across technology and across geographies, and to have people empathize with that need. Let's talk a little bit about when someone tells me they're lonely, I go immediately to sort of trying to solve that problem. And I'm hearing you say that empathy is probably the most important ways in which we can be present and not try and solve that problem. So if you can talk a little bit about empathy.
Yeah, empathy is simply being present, right? Compassion, the word compassion, right? To suffer with, etc. But we don't have to suffer together, right? But but
Mm.
but but I think it induces in some of us. Some will want to minimize it because they are unable to manage their own loneliness or what discomfort that the conversation might bring up in them. I think it's important to
Yeah.
recognize that I too have those some feelings and I'm not sure how to manage or tame them. Um, but then after that, right, the idea of just let me listen, acknowledge and affirm that what you feel is true, and I'm sorry
Yeah.
that that's what you're feeling. But I want you to
So
know
what is
that
the
I appreciate you. Huh?
Yeah, what is the positive side of, so once we're empathizing with someone who's got the loneliness, how do we transition from that empathy to finding that sense of belonging?
Yeah, I think there has to be a deliberate instruction to how we're going to have this conversation. That we can talk about what is lacking in our life, but to simultaneously talk about what is present. So
Mm.
it sustains us, it helps us endure and keep marching on until we've arrived to where we need to be. But it will be futile to wait until it's over for us to put ourselves back together. It's a parallel movement. So I think,
So do we have to spend time acknowledging where belonging exists, seeing where it exists?
seeing that
But if I
where
can't feel,
go ahead.
sorry, if I can't feel a sense of belonging, how do I feel that it exists in my life?
If I can, yeah, I think that's when it's really important to speak to a professional. to speak
Mm.
about this sense of aloneness, a void that I can't seem to fulfill or satisfy even when I'm having, really good conversations with friends,
Mm.
right?
Mm.
I think an acknowledgement of that, and that can often make people feel weak and vulnerable because it is an admission that I do not have it within me to internal structures to hold me together,
Mm. Mm.
and it can feel
Yeah.
shameful.
So at one level, friends can give that support, and for some people, that those structures are so far removed in their mind that they will need a therapist like you to walk them through how to get out of this dark, right? And is there a special role that loneliness plays in our life? Can loneliness play a positive role?
Yes, absolutely. There's constructive loneliness and there's not so constructive loneliness, right? The not so outcomes of some chronic loneliness are ways that we try and soothe ourselves you know, in a destructive way, right? The unconscious doesn't realize that or recognize that. All it knows is that you're afraid and I've got to take care of you. So we automatically might want to drink the beer, the milk bottle becomes a beer bottle, right? And it helps us forget about troubles and our sense of loneliness. Overeating, watching TV, loud music, anything to drown the internal dialogue that reminds us of what our demons are, the shadows of our life. But then there's a useful and constructive use of this alone time in the sense of solitude. How can I create? How can I meditation in a sense is the way to be quiet, to release, 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 release. A very mindful practice of really don't and to restore yourself again.
Yeah, so it seems like a lot of people, in terms of you look at social media, like a lot of people are using this alone time to create new art, cook with family. So there is this sort of, the isolation is stirring up people to fill it with creative acts. And as someone who's in the creative arts, I know how much isolation is fuel for creation, right? I also, we also see isolation in spiritual leaders, right? That before they make the, all the great spiritual leaders went to this isolated place where they had to question everything before they made the discovery, the universal discovery of the truths. So isolation is sort of the possibility of isolation to be a turning point for creative expression and spiritual growth is also there. So to not think of isolation and loneliness always only as one color, which is gray, but there's another color that exists within that if we are able to look for it and search for its meaning. And I think that the pandemic is doing that. It's bringing out a lot of people's, you can simultaneously see fear and depression and a spiral, and you can also see creative energy unearthed here.
I think we talked about a conversation about like how many baby little gardens are showing up, right?
Yeah.
Very act of nurturing a plant, we become the nurturer within ourselves as well. We're expanding the nurturer within us, the mother within us, the parent within us.
So it's sort of go back to that point in which we are experiencing that old wound of nurturing and safety, that people are finding their small places in which they can nurture in a plant, something that they feel that they can have a sense of giving back to something in a small way, and nurturing that and seeing that grow, and then somehow that's fueling their sense of belonging actually in the world again. So I think what is really beautiful in this conversation is the understanding of this original wound that is playing out for us during this pandemic and this isolation, and also really to observe how different people at different spectrums of that loneliness are using that loneliness. And some people really do need the sense of a quick sense of belonging. Some people need professional help, and some people are using that loneliness to start new forms of connectedness within themselves. So that's it's a really interesting thing to see that there is a spectrum of loneliness has both the dark and the color in it.
And there's a really
so
interesting effect of this. As people are returning to work now, they're afraid to belong.
Yeah, that's really interesting. What does that mean?
That they have gotten used to a certain discomfort and isolation. So we can
Yeah.
all get comfortable with the uncomfortable. We can all succumb in the process of survival, right? To assimilate, to adjust to pain.
Yeah.
And right.
Yeah.
Something positive, go belong. And yet I think this anxiety that comes up from a place of like, am I ready to go back to work in an unsafe world? Am I going to be able to hold myself even though I long to belong? And can I trust that the people out there whom I am desiring to belong to will serve as a community that will protect me?
Yeah, so in a way, the sense of belonging has been redefined. So we have got a taste of a different kind of belonging. Now going back to the old ways of belonging may not satisfy us anymore, and that is creating its own anxiety. So it's really interesting, right?
And I think fundamentally,
Brian,
sorry, go
ahead.
I think fundamentally we've got to develop the sense of belonging within ourselves. If we do not feel that we have within us some really valuable and worthy traits that will keep us alive, that will keep us going, that we have the ability within us to recreate connections, even if we were not taught that.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Hope, in a sense, gives us a goal, an intention of who we want to become.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, then with that, we sort of end this conversation, understanding that perhaps loneliness is a very special, has a very special role in this pandemic, and it's not to be just taken at face value. It's complex nature of why we are feeling a lack of safety and the longing for it, and also the different ways in which it can function in our lives. So thank you so much, Brian, for having this conversation with me. And I look forward to our next conversation together.
Thank you, Raymond, for having me. Bye.
Bye.